They took his name out of every record, erased him from every document. For 30 years, the world didn't know he existed. This is the story they tried to bury. September 26, 1983, 12:14 a.m. Moscow time. A 44-year-old lieutenant colonel sits in front of a computer screen deep inside a Soviet bunker. Suddenly, alarms start blaring. Red lights flash across the control room. The screen shows something that makes his blood run cold. 5 American nuclear missiles are heading straight for the Soviet Union. He has less than 5 minutes to make a decision that will determine whether 7 billion people live or die. His orders are crystal clear. If the computer says America has launched nuclear missiles, he must immediately report it to his superiors. They will launch a full-scale nuclear counterattack. Hundreds of millions will die in the first hour. Billions more in the nuclear winter that follows. The computer is never wrong. That's what they've been told. That's what he's supposed to believe. But something doesn't feel right. This is the true story of Stanislav Petrov, the man who had the weight of human civilization in his hands for 5 minutes, made a decision that went against every protocol, every order, every instinct, and saved the world. And then history forgot his name. Serpukhov 15 wasn't on any map. Located about 60 miles south of Moscow, this underground command center was one of the Soviet Union's most closely guarded secrets. Here, in a bunker built to survive a direct nuclear hit, Soviet officers monitored a newly installed early warning system called OKO, which means "eye" in Russian. The system was designed to detect American missile launches using satellites that monitored the United States 24/7. If those satellites detected the heat signature of an ICBM launch, the information would be transmitted to Serpukhov 15 within seconds. The officers there would then alert Soviet leadership, who would have minutes to decide whether to launch their own missiles in retaliation. This was the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. Mad they called it. And the name fit perfectly. Stanislav Petrov wasn't supposed to be on duty that night. He was filling in for a colleague who had called in sick. A last-minute substitution that would change the course of human history. I was tired, Petrov told me when I tracked him down decades later, living in a small apartment outside Moscow. I almost called in sick myself. Can you imagine? If I had stayed home that night, someone else would have been sitting in that chair. Someone who might have followed protocol exactly. He paused, staring out the window of his tiny kitchen. The world got lucky because I had a headache but came to work anyway. Stanislav Yevgrafovich Petrov wasn't a typical military hardliner. Born in 1939 in Vladivostok, he had grown up during World War II, watching his hometown transform from a peaceful port into a military fortress. His father had been a fighter pilot, his mother a nurse. Both had seen enough of war to hate it. My father never talked about his combat missions, Petrov's daughter, Yelena, told me. But sometimes I would hear him at night, crying in his sleep. He would wake up screaming about planes burning, about friends dying. That's what war gave him, nightmares that never ended. Stanislav had joined the Soviet Air Defense Forces not out of militaristic fervor, but because it was expected. In the Soviet Union, military service wasn't optional. But unlike many of his colleagues who dreamed of military glory, Petrov approached his work with a scientist's caution and a philosopher's doubt. He was always the one asking questions, recalled Viktor Mikhailov, who served with Petrov in the early 1980s. While other officers would accept orders without thinking, Stanislav would want to know why. Why this system? Why this procedure? Why should we trust this technology? This questioning nature had not made him popular with his superiors. In the Soviet military of the early 1980s, questioning wasn't encouraged. Obedience was. But on September 26, 1983, this tendency to question everything would become the most important quality any human being had ever possessed. The shift had been quiet until 12:14 a.m. Petrov sat at his station, monitoring the OKO system along with about 20 other officers. The bunker was deep underground, insulated from the outside world. No windows, no natural light, just the constant hum of computers and the glow of monitoring screens. Then the alarm sounded. It was like nothing I had ever heard, Petrov remembered, his hands still trembling slightly even decades later. A piercing sound designed to shock you into action. And immediately, the main screen showed it, missile launch detected. According to the system, one American Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missile had been launched from a base in the United States. It would reach Soviet territory in approximately 25 minutes. But Petrov and his crew didn't have 25 minutes to make a decision. By the time the missile was halfway across the Atlantic, it would be too late to respond. They had 5 minutes, maybe less, to report this to Soviet military command. The protocol was unambiguous. The moment a launch was detected, Petrov was required to pick up the red phone that connected directly to Soviet military headquarters and report, "America has launched nuclear missiles. We are under attack." His hand reached for the phone. Then the screen updated. Not one missile. 5 missiles. 5 separate launch signatures, all from different locations in the United States. All heading toward the Soviet Union. The room erupted in controlled chaos. Officers began shouting coordinates, checking systems, preparing reports. This was it. This was the nuclear war they had trained for, feared, and somehow always believed would never actually happen. But Stanislav Petrov didn't pick up the phone. Something was wrong, Petrov told me, leaning forward in his chair. If America was going to launch a first strike, why would they only launch 5 missiles? They had thousands. 5 missiles couldn't cripple our nuclear arsenal. It didn't make tactical sense. His mind raced through the possibilities. The doctrine of nuclear war called for massive, overwhelming strikes. You don't start World War III with 5 missiles. You start it with hundreds, maybe thousands, all at once, trying to destroy as much of your enemy's nuclear capability as possible before they can respond. 5 missiles seemed like a mistake. But the computer was certain. The most advanced early warning system the Soviet Union had ever built was screaming at him that missiles were incoming. The system had cost billions of rubles to develop. It had been tested extensively. Soviet scientists and engineers had assured everyone it was nearly infallible. Nearly. I kept thinking about how new the system was, Petrov said. We'd only had it operational for a few months. There were still bugs being worked out. And I remembered during training, the engineers mentioned that sometimes satellite sensors could be confused by sunlight reflecting off clouds in certain conditions. It was September 26th, early autumn. The angle of the sun at that time of night, the cloud cover over the United States, it was possible, barely possible, that the satellites were seeing sun reflections and interpreting them as missile launches. But it was also possible that 5 American nuclear missiles were currently screaming through space towards Soviet cities. My job wasn't to analyze whether it made tactical sense, Petrov said quietly. My job was to report what the computer said. That's all. Report and let the generals decide. He looked at the red phone again. Around him, officers were waiting for him to make the call. The alarm continued its piercing wail. The screen kept showing the same thing. 5 missiles inbound. He thought about his wife and children, sleeping peacefully at home, with no idea that their father was about to make a decision that would determine whether they lived or died. He thought about all the children in Russia, in America, in Europe, everywhere. 5 minutes had become 4 minutes. Then 3. Finally, Stanislav Petrov made his decision. He picked up the phone. But instead of reporting an attack, he said 4 words that changed history. False alarm. System malfunction. The next 23 minutes were, according to everyone in that bunker, the most terrifying of their lives. If Petrov was right, and it was a false alarm, the missiles wouldn't arrive. The system would eventually clear the error, and they would all go home with a story about the night the computer glitched. Petrov was wrong. Soviet cities would start exploding in nuclear fire. Millions would die. And it would be his fault for not reporting the attack in time for the Soviet Union to respond. I couldn't sit still, Petrov remembered. I paced back and forth, watching the clock, waiting. Some of the officers were angry with me. They thought I had made a terrible mistake. They were already preparing reports about my failure to follow protocol. Viktor Petrov, no relation to Stanislav, who was in the bunker that night, told me, we were all watching the clock. 20 minutes until the missiles should hit. Then 15. Then 10. Some guys were praying. Some were crying. Stanislav just stood there, staring at the screen, waiting to see if he had just killed us all. At 12:37 a.m., 23 minutes after the initial alarm, the system updated. No missiles detected. The launches had been errors. The system had malfunctioned exactly as Petrov had suspected. Satellite sensors had mistaken sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds for missile launches. The bunker erupted in chaos. Some officers cheered. Others collapsed in relief. A few were physically sick from the stress. Stanislav Petrov just sat back down at his station and continued his shift. He still had 7 hours of duty remaining. "What was I supposed to do?" he said with a slight smile. "Take the rest of the night off?" You'd think that saving the world from nuclear annihilation would make Stanislav Petrov a hero. You'd be wrong. Soviet military leadership was furious, not at the system malfunction, but at Petrov for not following protocol. He had made a decision independently instead of simply reporting what the computer said and letting his superiors handle it. "They called me in for questioning," Petrov remembered, his expression darkening. "For weeks, they interrogated me. Why didn't you follow procedure? Who gave you authority to make that decision? What if you had been wrong?" The Soviet military had a problem. If they acknowledged publicly that their brand new early warning system had nearly caused World War III, it would be a massive embarrassment. It would also reveal to the Americans that the Soviet system was unreliable, potentially inviting an actual first strike. So they did what authoritarian regimes do best. They covered it up. The incident was classified. Petrov was told never to speak about what happened. The official report blamed him for improper filing of paperwork during the incident. He received no commendation, no medal, no recognition. "They wanted me to disappear," Petrov said, "to pretend that night never happened. And for many years I did." In 1984, less than a year after the incident, Petrov was quietly reassigned to a less sensitive position. By 1984, he was offered early retirement, which wasn't really optional. At age 45, his military career was over. He took a job as a senior engineer at a research institute, where he worked in obscurity for the next decade. His colleagues had no idea they were working alongside the man who had saved human civilization. The incident remained classified for nearly 10 years. The world went on, completely unaware of how close it had come to nuclear apocalypse on September 26, 1983. Then, in 1993, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a former Soviet general named Yuri Votintsev published his memoirs. Buried in the middle of the book was a brief mention of an incident in 1983 where a Soviet officer had correctly identified a false alarm in the early warning system. Votintsev didn't name Petrov, but he provided enough details that investigative journalists were able to piece together what had happened and who had been involved. When reporters first contacted Petrov in 1998, he was living in a small town outside Moscow in a simple 2-room apartment. He was surviving on a military pension of about $200 per month. He had sold most of his possessions, including his awards from his military service, just to pay for food and medicine. "At first, I didn't want to talk about it," Petrov told the first journalist who tracked him down. "What was the point? It was ancient history. Nobody cared about an old Soviet officer and a computer error from 15 years ago." But the journalist convinced him to tell his story. And when it was published, the world finally learned the truth about September 26, 1983. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The story of Stanislav Petrov spread across the globe. Major newspapers ran features. Documentaries were made. Petrov was invited to speak at conferences on nuclear disarmament and world peace. In 2004, the Association of World Citizens gave him the World Citizen Award. In 2006, he was honored at the United Nations in New York. In 2011, he received the Dresden Peace Prize in Germany. Kevin Costner, the actor, personally presented him with an award and covered his travel expenses to come to the United States for a ceremony. "I told him," Costner said later, "that I made a movie about nuclear war called The Postman. It was fiction, but what he did was real. He's more of a hero than any character I ever played." But the attention came too late for Petrov to enjoy it fully. His wife, Raisa, had died in 1997, before the world knew his story. She lived her whole life not knowing that her husband saved the world, their daughter Yelena told me. She died thinking he was just a regular engineer who had an unremarkable military career. I wish she could have known the truth. Petrov's health was also declining. The stress of the incident, combined with years of poverty and the Soviet Union's collapse, had taken their toll. He suffered from declining health and depression. The awards were nice, Petrov said during one of our conversations. But they didn't change anything. I was still living in the same small apartment. I still had barely enough money for food. The world said I was a hero, but I was still struggling to survive. There's a bitter irony in his story. Western organizations and individuals who learned about what he had done tried to help him financially, but Russian authorities made it difficult. Donations sent to him were often held up by bureaucracy or taxed heavily. The Russian government, still embarrassed by the incident, wanted nothing to do with celebrating someone who had highlighted a failure in Soviet military systems. As recognition grew in the West, Petrov's relationship with Russian authorities and former military colleagues became more complicated. Some praised him as a hero. Others accused him of betraying military secrets by talking to foreign journalists. "They can't decide if I'm a hero or a traitor," Petrov said with dark humor in a 2010 interview. "I saved the world from nuclear war, but I made the Soviet military look bad. So which is more important?" The psychological toll was immense. Petrov suffered from what would now be recognized as PTSD. He had nightmares about what would have happened if he'd made the wrong decision. "Sometimes I dream that I picked up the phone and reported the attack," he confessed in one interview. "I dream about the missiles launching in response. About the explosions. About all those people dying because of me. Then I wake up and realize it didn't happen. But in the dream, it feels so real." He also carried the burden of knowing that his decision, while correct, had technically violated every rule he was supposed to follow. "What if I had been wrong?" he would ask. "What if those had been real missiles and Soviet cities had been destroyed because I didn't report it in time? I would have been responsible for millions of deaths." Dr. Patricia Lewis, a nuclear disarmament expert who interviewed Petrov multiple times, explained, "He lived with an impossible weight. He made the right call, but he could never know for absolute certain. There was always that tiny doubt. What if I had been wrong? That kind of uncertainty eats at a person." Stanislav Petrov's story raises uncomfortable questions that remain relevant today. First, why was one person sitting in a bunker given the power to effectively decide whether nuclear war would begin? The system was designed with the assumption that computers would be reliable and humans would simply follow orders. But what happened that night proved that both assumptions were wrong. The system failed that night, explained Dr. Bruce Blair, a former nuclear missile officer who studied the incident. Not just the computer system, but the entire command and control system. "We built a structure where one tired officer, making a split-second decision based on incomplete information, could determine the fate of human civilization." Second, how many other close calls have there been that we don't know about? Experts estimate there have been dozens of incidents during the Cold War where nuclear war was narrowly avoided. Some we know about, like this one, or the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. But how many remain classified? How many times has humanity come within minutes of extinction without ever knowing it? Third, what does it say about our world that the man who saved it died in poverty while we build monuments to military leaders who won battles but killed thousands? "We honor generals who successfully killed the enemy," noted peace activist David Krieger. "But the man who successfully prevented the killing of everyone got a small apartment and a tiny pension. What does that tell us about what we actually value?" In his last years, Petrov lived alone in his small apartment in Fryazino, a town about 20 miles from Moscow. His health continued to decline. He suffered from diabetes and high blood pressure. Moving around became difficult. Some journalists and documentary filmmakers who had interviewed him over the years stayed in touch. They would call to check on him, sometimes sending money for medical expenses or groceries. These small acts of kindness from strangers meant more to him than the official awards. "The recognition was nice," he said in one of his last interviews. But the phone calls from regular people who just wanted to say thank you, those meant more. Teachers who told me they taught their students about that night. Parents who named their children after me. Those connections reminded me why I made the decision I did. On May 19, 2017, Stanislav Petrov died in his apartment at the age of 77. He had been dead for several months before anyone found him. His body was discovered only when neighbors noticed an unpleasant smell coming from his apartment and called authorities. The man who saved 7 billion lives died alone, and nobody even knew for 4 months. When news of Petrov's death finally became public in September 2017, 6 months after he had died, the response was overwhelming. Newspapers around the world ran obituaries. The United Nations observed a moment of silence. Ordinary people who learned his story for the first time left flowers outside the Russian embassy in their cities. He was the most important person of the 20th century that nobody knew about, wrote one historian. More important than presidents and generals and kings. Because all of their achievements would have meant nothing if Stanislav Petrov had picked up that phone and followed orders. The Russian government's response was notably muted. While some officials acknowledged his passing, there was no state funeral, no national day of mourning, no special recognition. The man who had saved Russia from nuclear annihilation was buried quietly, with only family and a few friends in attendance. Today, there are memorials to Petrov in several countries, but not in Russia. There's a monument in Dresden, Germany. A street in Brooklyn, New York was named after him. In 2018, a documentary about his life won several international awards. But in Russia, there's almost nothing. A few historians have pushed for official recognition, but it hasn't happened. The incident remains an embarrassment to Russian military pride. "My father saved the world," Yelena Petrov said in 2018. But his own country won't honor him for it. They're still more concerned about protecting the reputation of a computer system that hasn't existed for 30 years than celebrating the man who prevented a nuclear holocaust. The story of Stanislav Petrov isn't just about one night in 1983. It's about the fragility of human civilization and the power of individual choice. We like to think that systems will protect us, that technology is reliable, that protocols and procedures will keep us safe. But September 26, 1983 proved that sometimes the only thing standing between civilization and annihilation is one person's willingness to think for themselves instead of blindly following orders. "I didn't feel like I was saving the world," Petrov said in one of his last interviews. "I was just doing what seemed right in that moment." But maybe that's what heroism is, not some grand gesture, but just choosing to think for yourself when everyone else is telling you to follow the rules. His story also reveals an uncomfortable truth about how we define heroism. We build monuments to military victories. We celebrate generals who won battles. We remember presidents who made tough decisions. But the man who prevented the ultimate battle, who made the toughest decision in human history, died alone and forgotten in a small apartment. Dr. Patricia Lewis put it perfectly. Stanislav Petrov represents the best of humanity, the ability to think clearly under pressure, to question authority when necessary, to value human life above protocol. He also represents the worst of humanity, how we forget those who serve us, how we allow heroes to die in poverty, how we care more about institutional pride than individual courage. Today, September 26th is unofficially observed by some peace organizations as World Day for Nuclear Abolition or Stanislav Petrov Day. Small groups around the world gather to remember what almost happened and to honor the man who prevented it. But most people don't know about it. September 26, 1983 remains one of the most important dates in human history that nobody remembers. Think about it. You probably know the date of Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. You probably know the date of D-Day, June 6, 1944. You might even know the date of the fall of the Berlin Wall, November 9, 1989. But do you know September 26, 1983? The day human civilization came within 5 minutes of ending? The day one tired Soviet officer decided to trust his judgment over his orders? We don't teach it in schools. There are no movies about it. No best-selling books. It's not a national holiday anywhere. And Stanislav Petrov, the man who gave us all a future, died poor, alone, and largely forgotten. In one of his last interviews, Petrov was asked what he wanted people to remember about him. His answer was simple and profound. I don't care if people remember my name. I just hope they remember that nuclear war is insane. That no matter what the computers say, no matter what the politicians claim, no matter what the generals insist, nuclear weapons will only ever bring death. All of them. Everywhere. He paused, looking out his window at the quiet street where children were playing. Those children out there exist because I made a decision 30 years ago. Their children will exist. Their grandchildren. Maybe people won't know my name, but every life that continues, every baby born, every achievement made, those are my legacy. Not because I'm special, but because I was in the right place at the right moment and made the right choice. And I hope, he added quietly, that if someone else is ever in that position again, and I pray they never are, I hope they think clearly, question what they're being told, and choose life over protocol. Stanislav Petrov's story is a mirror we should all look into. It shows us what we claim to value versus what we actually value. We say we honor peace, but we spend trillions on weapons. We say we celebrate heroes, but we let the greatest hero of the modern age die in poverty. We say we learn from history, but how many people reading this had ever heard of September 26, 1983 before today? The computers told Petrov that missiles were coming. His orders told him to report immediately. His training told him to trust the system. But something deeper, his humanity, his skepticism, his unwillingness to blindly follow orders that didn't make sense, told him to wait. He chose to think for himself. And in doing so, he gave every person alive today the gift of existence. You're reading this because Stanislav Petrov decided to trust his judgment. Your children exist because Stanislav Petrov decided to trust his judgment. Every achievement since 1983, every medical breakthrough, every technological innovation, every act of kindness, every moment of love, all of it exists because one man in a Soviet bunker decided that the world was worth saving, even if it cost him his career. This is the story of Stanislav Petrov, the man who saved 7 billion lives and died unknown, the hero we forgot, the decision that changed everything. Now you know his name. Now you know what he did. And now you have a responsibility to remember, because history forgot him once. We can't let it happen again. If this story moved you, honor Stanislav Petrov's memory by sharing it. Every person who learns his name is another small victory against the obscurity that he didn't deserve. Hit subscribe for more stories of forgotten heroes who changed the world. And this September 26th, take a moment to remember the man who gave us all a future. Because heroes like Stanislav Petrov don't need monuments. They just need to be remembered.